Pleased to have with us today the ADA guru at Segovia. And how many of you have seen Jess present before? You're in for a treat. He has a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, and does a great job of imparting that. If you have questions about how to work with people with disabilities, what's the right way to handle things, he's got the answers. He spent 25 years in his career developing innovative and fully accessible public transit and human services transportation programs and services. He has a unique background in transportation, having worked in ADA paratransit, fixer-up bus and rail, as well as multiple municipality worker and as a consultant. So we're excited to have him here with us today. Please, at some point before the end, scan this code on the back of your book and please fill out the evaluation to make sure that we're capturing your feedback and make sure these conferences just get better and better. So Jess, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Wonderful to be here. We're good on the recording? Can you ask the gentleman in the back to... Well, thank you, everyone. Pleasure to be back again this year. I think there was some great feedback from last year's sessions. If we're able to perhaps turn the system in the back off, that would be great. Thank you. Yeah, wonderful to be back again. And I was advised that this would be a more management-oriented session. And so the information that I've provided for you today, I want this to be a discussion, interaction. I think that's when we learn the most. There's not a whole lot we can do in an hour, but I'm able to share a new concept with you and really help understand your challenges and to answer your questions related to providing accessible public transit services for people with disabilities. That is our requirement. Can you ask the gentleman to turn that system off?
Turn it off.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right, so we'll talk about complying with Transit's ADA compliance requirements. What I hope we'll be able to achieve today, of course, to help enhance your knowledge of the ADA. Not what does this regulation say, what does that regulation say. It's difficult to do in a short period of time, but to start to develop a philosophy, to understand the ADA as a whole. What is it trying to achieve? It's not trying to achieve giving riders with disabilities everything they want when they want it. It is to provide accessible transportation services up to the point where we are unable to. It's not safe for us to do it, or there's some issues that are preventing us from safely delivering services and operating our vehicles. It's very important from the management perspective especially to understand what your culture of accessibility is. Whether you know it or think about it like this or not, your organization has a culture that drives how decisions are made regarding the services you provide for people with disabilities. And so I'm going to talk to you about some concepts with regards to that for you to think about, well, how does my agency work, right? How are important decisions made in my agency? And is that in the best interest of our employees, of our service, of our riders? So we'll do a little introspection when we talk about that. And understanding whether our agency is policy driven. So when something goes wrong, when a decision needs to be made, it is a policy that is driving the decision, or are we personality driven? It is a person. It is the CEO, the director of transit, telling staff what to do. And that may or may not be rooted in the ADA's requirements. That might be rooted in their mood that day. It might be rooted in who's asking them, what the issue is, what is their knowledge and experience. And so you're probably guessing what type of approach I think is most appropriate and most consistent, but we'll talk about that more. I'll share with you some concept I developed called the 5 pillars of ADA compliance. Why is the ADA so complicated, and why do we have sessions on this every year? Because it's looked at in total, and when we look at it hundreds and hundreds of pages long, and these regulations, and do I need to do it exactly like this? Do I have choices? It's complicated. People are very confused. People are afraid to make decisions because there's a lot of uncertainty. So I made an attempt, my years of experience, presenting information, answering questions, working with transit agencies of all sizes. It started to become clear that there's actually an organization within the ADA that I think would be helpful to all of you. And so I'll share that with you today. You heard a little bit about myself. I think what's most unique about the work that I have done is that I've worked in every angle, if you will, of public transportation. In paratransit, fixed route bus, in rail, as a contractor, consultant, as a public employee, as a transit manager, having 6 vehicles to serve a growing community and not enough funds. So, and I've worked for multi-billion-dollar agencies that have all the money in the world, but do they have the right operating concepts and policies and approach, right? Money doesn't fix everything. Money buys amazing technology, but it's what we do with it, right? Money can buy a lot of training for staff, but what if the content of that training isn't ideal, right? Isn't reflective of not just the ADA, but of the way that you want your services to be provided to people with disabilities. I mean, there's no point in providing accessible public transportation if it doesn't meet the needs of your riders, right? So that's often where the challenge comes. What do my riders want and say they need? What am I able to afford? And what does the ADA say about all of these things? And how much responsibility or how much do I want to risk safety? I have a client in Texas, and they had a rider that was a lady in a wheelchair who was boarding with a wagon. You know those folding wagons like you take to soccer matches? So she was able to, in her wheelchair, power wheelchair, pull and to drag this wagon along behind her, and it carried everything that she needed in there. And the question was, what do we do with that? Do we allow her to board our vehicles with that? Does it matter if it's fixed route bus or paratransit? Does that wagon meet the definition of a wheelchair, right? The definition of a wheelchair is 3 or more wheels, designed, modified, used by a person with a mobility disability, and usable indoors. Does that wagon meet that definition? So that's just one example of the challenging decisions that we need to make. And so if we don't have good policies, if we don't have a good understanding of the ADA, what does the ADA want us to do? Well, it doesn't want us to give everything that a person with a disability wants. It doesn't want that. It wants us to support them in providing a reasonable level of assistance, and we can define reasonable as safe. The easiest definition, I would say, would be providing safe transportation. So I think my unique experience, and then over the last 10 years really focusing on ADA compliance and training, large agencies, small agencies, getting calls every day. What do I do about this? How do we address that? So I'm definitely in a position to at least talk your issues through. If at any point you have a question, a comment, please raise your hand. I really do want this to be as interactive. And I think what's more important to me is that I answer your questions and we address your misunderstandings, your incidents that have happened. I think that's more important to me than getting through a presentation that I created, right? My presentation is sort of guidance for us. And then I want what you all need and what your questions are to take us in the direction that we need to go, okay? So let's start with the 5 pillars of ADA compliance, and hopefully you all have the handout that I provided. There's a few more over there on the side if you didn't. But we need to look at the ADA as sort of a family of concepts. I really think that's what helps make this the most easy for us to understand. Pillar number 1, the built environment, right? We have to have accessible vehicles. We need to maintain those vehicles, right? We need to have our facilities. Are they accessible? And that's very challenging in bus stop accessibility, isn't it? We could have bus stops that are 30, 40, 50 years old before the ADA was signed into law. What do we do about that? How do inaccessible bus stops affect paratransit eligibility? There is a direct connection. And a lot of times we don't understand that because the bus staff's doing one thing over there, right? And there could be city staff handling the bus stops, not even transit staff. And then we have a whole nother side, typically, depending on the size of your agency, the paratransit staff. And maybe you have a contractor handling eligibility, or you have some staff managing that process for you. How is it all? It's all connected. One absolutely impacts the other. So pillar number 1, right? The built environment. Pillar number 2 is our policies, our procedures. Policies are what we say we're going to do, and procedures are how we are going to do it. And I think what I see mostly is that hopefully an agency has a decent amount of policies, but often those policies are lacking the detail. They tell the driver, for example, to ensure that safe transportation services are provided to people with disabilities. I don't even know what that means. What does that mean with regards to how to safely board a person in a wheelchair on and off of a bus or a cutaway or a minivan, right? Do you have any procedures? Here's an example of a situation that I'm helping an agency with. There were 2 riders with disabilities on a cutaway. How do you board both of these people and secure them and remove? Do you remove one of them at a time? Do you leave the first one secured or the person on the inside secured while you help the person on the outside? Do you unsecure them both at the same time? These are all choices, but the choices that we make reflect the level of safety and our commitment to safety. And so I think that's a very good example of, we will say, yes, drivers are to safely assist riders with disabilities, including those in wheelchairs, on and off the vehicle, but are we telling them exactly the way we want them to do it, right? A lot of policies I'm seeing are lacking the detail of, we want the rider pointing away from the vehicle in their wheelchair, right? That puts the majority of the weight closest to the vehicle. That's probably what lift equipment specifications would say, how to board, but do the policies say that? Does information spill in from the equipment manufacturer's guidance, manual, etc.? Does it spill into our operating policies? And so we need to really understand what policies we need. We need to draft them properly, and even in some very specific cases, likely have some procedures, exactly how we want staff to do it. Pillar number 3 is training staff to proficiency. That is actually the language from the ADA. We need to train staff to be experts in their job. The ADA tells us that we need to train staff so that they can consistently and safely complete tasks that they are required to complete as a part of their job responsibilities. And so we have the physical, right? Pillar number 1, accessible equipment. We need to maintain it properly, etc. We have our policies. Now those policies need to roll into pillar number 3, training. Does our training ensure that we are creating experts in the work that they are doing? Pillar number 4, compliance oversight. So we have the physical, we have our policies. We are training our staff to be experts. Who's watching our staff? Pillar number 4, compliance oversight, especially if we have a contractor operating services on our behalf. We do need to, I would say, have a formal approach to ensuring that we have proper oversight of our staff. Who's watching drivers to make sure they're boarding people in wheelchairs properly? I don't want your agency to wait to realize, you know what, we don't have great oversight of our staff. I don't want you to think about that because someone got injured or worse. And I'm also an expert witness on lawsuits, and that's when they call me, right? An agency calls and says something happened and a rider got injured or worse. Or a family will call me and the attorney will call me to say this agency was not responsible in how they took care of this individual and they were injured or worse. I would say half of the cases that I work on honestly have to do with someone passing away because of the actions or inaction of a driver. And these are almost always, it seems, 75% of the time at least, people in wheelchairs, people using wheelchairs. And so I feel like we can target and control where our most sensitive riders are and where these incidents tend to happen over and over and over again. So having formal oversight of our services is very, very important, and of our staff. And then pillar number 5, rider education, right? How do our riders know, especially in paratransit, but even in fixed route services and other demand responsive services, how do they know how to use our service? How do they know what number to call, what information is needed to make a reservation, right? How do we share information in a way where we are creating a realistic expectation of our service? I think this is where a lot of agencies, they stop just short of actually educating all of their ridership. I know a lot of agencies, even smaller ones, that have a travel training program, but that's done individually, right? So maybe you get through a few dozen people a year. I mean, it depends on your program. And you have thousands of riders. So travel training, yes, it has a purpose. It works. We can prove that it can divert trips off of paratransit and on to fixed route services, which is something that we all want, especially if we are at or near capacity in our paratransit, at or near budget, right, our available funding, then we want people to transition off of paratransit and onto fixed route services. And so maybe a rider's guide is one way to educate. Obviously, the content of our websites is a way that we educate ridership to create a realistic expectation of services, to tell them what the ADA says, not for them to come to the conclusion that the ADA says whatever I want it to say because I'm a person with a disability. I've come across riders like that in my career, not many, but they'll tell me the ADA is there to protect me and to give me whatever I need or want because I'm a person with a disability. I know what I need. That is not the case. How do we communicate that with them? Maybe seat drops, right? Some other things. So, and you know, these pillars need to, of course, be set on a solid foundation. Do we have a good hiring process? All right, are we vetting staff properly? We don't want to find out that a driver is not able or willing to secure people in wheelchairs at the end of their training, right? We need to find this out in advance. We don't want to find out on the first, second, third day of them operating in service when a person with a service animal boards and we find out, oh, this driver's allergic to dogs, right? We need to find these things out in advance. So I know it's easy for me to say that. I know it's very difficult to find and keep drivers right now. So sometimes agencies are making these choices that maybe in the past we would not have. So I understand what we need to do to keep the wheels moving, but when we have the opportunity, we need to make sure, of course, that we don't hire people that, whether they think they have a good reason or not as a driver, to discriminate against riders with disabilities. We have to have a public commitment to accessibility, right? We need to have some guidance from leadership, our board, telling us, those in management, supervisors, etc., what our goal is to become the most accessible public transit agency in Utah, right? I think that would be a great goal, right? To meet the needs of our riders and to support their ability to live independently in our community. Those are great goals, and now we need to define, well, what does that mean for my service, right? What does that mean with regards to what level of service that I can provide? The example I gave a few minutes ago about the wagon, the ADA doesn't say you don't have to transport that rider with the wagon. The ADA says you get to decide whether you want to transport the person in that wagon or not. I could think of 2 or 3 reasons right off the top of my head why I would not want to transport that wagon. It can't be folded, right? The rider is in a wheelchair, so she's going to be boarded first, or he or she's going to be boarded first, right? That rider. And so apparently that leaves the wagon to be in the control and responsibility of the driver. Do we want our drivers to have that kind of responsibility for someone else's belongings and equipment? You can say yes to that, but when we take possession, when we take control, what else do we take and accept? Responsibility. And that's why I say this is an agency by agency choice, right? So you have to decide, using your culture of accessibility, what your interpretation of whether that is safe or unsafe, reasonable or unreasonable, if that's a level of service you want to provide. And the ADA gave us the reasonable modification of policies language in the ADA. It gave us that, and it gave us a process for us to formally consider requests for us to do something that either our policies don't require us to do, or someone doesn't want us to do something that our policy requires, right? And so there's lots of tools in the ADA. Yes, question?
So a woman in a wheelchair with the wagon.
Yes.
What if she wasn't in a wheelchair and lifted the wagon
Uh-huh.
onto the bus? Would you say you can't come on this bus with that wagon?
Well, it would depend what your policy is. If I were drafting a policy, right, we all draft policies and we all have interpretations or opinions on things based on our experience or knowledge. Based on my experience and knowledge of public transit, I would have in my code of conduct language, for example, statements like, equipment, etc., is allowed on the vehicles as long as it does not block the aisles, block a doorway, take a seat from another paying customer or otherwise create an unsafe situation on board. And so I can't specifically answer your question. I don't know if we're talking about on a bus. I don't know if we're talking about on a minivan. Much more complicated on a minivan, right? Not any space there. Are we talking about a large cutaway? So it really depends on space availability, depends on demand, right? The problem that this agency was having with this request for the wagon was that they had 2 wheelchair securement locations on their vehicle, and so one was taken by the rider and the other was taken by this wagon. And what was their demand for the wheelchair securement space by riders with disabilities? If the demand was, this was the only rider in a wheelchair we have, well, maybe that doesn't create an issue, right? Because there's no competition for that second space. What if you have someone in a wheelchair boarding every other stop? Or in your paratransit, all of your vehicles out there in operation, you're just hanging on by having enough wheelchair securement space for your staff or for your riders using wheelchairs. And now the wagon? So you have to decide if you want to allow the wagon to potentially become a barrier to the use of your service by a person in a wheelchair who potentially you're going to have to deny boarding, right? It's maybe a little easier to manage if we're talking about demand responsive services because someone is calling, they're making a reservation. We can specifically track how many wheelchair spaces we will be using, in any given moment. Nonetheless, it creates some challenges, right? So lots of choices for us to make, yes.
So you could probably secure that wagon possibly, but you can't really secure all the belongings that's in that wagon. So if there was an accident, those would just be projectiles.
Yes, but I think we have examples of safety is always a concern, but we have examples of people bringing grocery bags on board if policy allows. Those bags could fly around in an accident. And we typically do allow those folding carts, right? 4 little wheels, kind of tall folding carts. People have their groceries. They're able to bring them in close and not block the aisle. So we do have some examples of items on board where just so much backpacks could become projected. Can you imagine, this thing in a high-speed forward-moving accident bouncing around? It'd be like a bullet inside that vehicle. So we have to be careful not to over-concern ourselves, but definitely securing that wagon. It is not what the equipment was designed for, right? By definition, that wagon is not a wheelchair. It does have 3 or more wheels, but it was not designed to assist a person with a disability with their mobility. It wasn't. It was designed to carry things for people, right? Yes?
Related to that, do you have best practices for OPDMDs on transit systems?
OP, can you
Other power-driven mobility devices.
give me some specific examples?
So our specific example is the two-wheel, the hoverboard, two-wheel hoverboards.
Two-wheel
I'm in
hoverboard.
Zion, and we've had people come and try and board the bus in Zion using the two-wheel hoverboards, saying this is how I get around because I'm a veteran with an amputation. So this is easier for me to get around.
Sure.
So it's kind of that fuzzy line between what defines an OPDMD and what is best practice and how you attach that so that it doesn't roll around the shuttle and whether it's taking another seat. Do you know of any best practices in those conditions?
Well, I think we can talk that through. If we use the definition of a wheelchair, it does not fit the definition, right? It's not designed for a person with a disability to assist with their mobility, so that's off the table. I think we just have to take a reasonable approach. Do we have any other items that are just as large or larger that we allow on board that people are able to be transported with? If they're able to hold it in their person, in their seat, and it's not blocking the aisle, not blocking the doors, not creating an unsafe situation, I don't know why we wouldn't allow it on board, right? So I don't know specifically how large these things, is it come like that and they stand on it, or?
The one-wheel one that we had most recently is a platform about this big. They're fairly heavy.
They can pick them up, board, sit and hold them between their legs or whatever. So if we want to, when we make decisions like this, we make a determination that's going to impact someone, potentially either deny them services because we think it's unsafe or not. We need to really think about what happens if this were to become a formal issue, right? Maybe a lawsuit. So we need to make sure that our decision making is rock solid and that we document all of this. And so considering, we're talking through, it's not a mobility device. Does it create any unsafe situations? No, it doesn't. Does it take up another seat? It doesn't sound like it does. And so from my perspective, at least with the information that I have so far, it doesn't sound to me like there would be a reason for us to deny it coming on board. We have other examples of battery operated devices. I mean, wheelchairs, scooters are battery operated. And so is there any information that I'm missing that makes you feel like it's not safe for them to bring it on board? I mean, it's smaller than the folding cart that we regularly allow on our transit agencies. As a best practice nationally, we do. Not every agency does everything the same, but
We're a unique system, for sure, in the national park.
Sure.
So, I mean, that's just one example
Yeah.
of a bigger issue.
yeah.
Access and where they're going with it, allowing it on trails, because that's what they're accessing.
Well, that is a very different issue.
So
And
it's a little bit broader issue, and when I've had discussions with our regional accessibility coordinator, there are sections in the ADA specifically about other power-driven mobility devices and the definition of that, but it's just such a fuzzy gray area that
Yeah.
we're trying to figure it out.
I understand. I have a feeling that if there wasn't this negative impact of these devices being used on your trails when they're not supposed to be, there probably wouldn't be a whole lot to talk about. I think it'd be an easy decision to make. Well, there's really nothing safety related. Let them on board. But because of what they're going to do with it, which honestly is outside of the purview of public transit, and so we have to be really careful with that one, right? So great questions. I mean, and this is what I want. I want to talk about your unique challenges. Absolutely. Let's talk very quickly about the culture of accessibility. Okay, we have policy-driven organizations. Your agency either is policy-driven or personality-driven. There might be times where you're lost in the middle somewhere, but if a policy-driven organization does have a set of formal standards for operation, right? If we have an operational challenge decision to make, it is our policies that we look to make those decisions. The decisions are based on the guidance provided by the policies that we have created. And interestingly, when leadership changes, our service does not. That is one of, I think, the biggest benefits of having a policy-driven organization. We are able to achieve consistency because no matter who, the manager, the CEO, whoever, right? It is not that person, it is not their personality, these other things that is driving how services are being delivered and what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. So I would say that's definitely one of the positives, right? When we make decisions using policy, we can see that as a transparent process. I know how the decision was made, right? Not just it was made behind closed doors by a couple people. That's where things can get a little dangerous, right? Yes, please.
Will your slides be available to us
Yeah,
after?
yeah, I'll make them available. I'll give the PDFs to Stacy, and I don't know, she'll put them on your website or distribute them. I would love to get your business cards. I do send out emails, ADA tips, training. Several of you mentioned your staff taking my online training. So if you want to leave your business card either on your chair or on the table at the door, and I'll send them to you directly, and it'd be great for you to have that information. So we'll make sure you get that definitely. Policy-driven organizations value institutional knowledge. What is institutional knowledge? All of the years leading up to how we are delivering our services today, our great, consistent services. If we don't have that knowledge in policies, if we don't have that knowledge as a part of our training material, etc., we are one person's retirement away from having to start over at zero. I was doing an accessibility review as a part of a transit plan in Northern California, and spent the day, looked at all their equipment, rode their services, reviewed their policies with them, interviewed staff, and they answered everything amazingly. But when we got to the policies part and I asked, please, your obviously the knowledge here is significant. I mean, you could be doing what I'm doing. That's how much knowledge they had. But when I asked for their policies, they had like 3 pages of policies. But the questions that they were answering they were answers that were not covered in those policies. And I said, where is this information that you're using to answer my questions? Where is this documented? And they didn't have it documented. And the gentleman was going to be retiring in like a year. And I said, well, let me paint a picture for you. You're going to retire, Mr. Operations Manager, and your agency's really going to struggle. They are not going to be able to answer these questions that I'm asking a year from now unless we start creating a formal set of policies and we get all of this stuff out of your head and into a document and then implement it into our service. And so institutional knowledge, I mean, I've seen great agencies doing wonderful work literally start at zero when a new group of management came in, and when all of that experiences and all of those, I mean, we could still call them policies even though they're not documented, but maybe they're more like practices. Anything that you're doing that is not documented, good or bad, I think that's just a practice. And we don't want practices, right? How do you defend a practice in a lawsuit? I've been doing a lot of that work lately. And I ask, let me see your policies. Let me see your training reflective of those policies. Tell me about your oversight program. Oh, you don't have one. And then we see that the reason that the rider got injured was because the driver was doing something else, something that they weren't guided to do, something that wasn't addressed in their policies. So we have to be really careful, right? We also have to be careful about clicks. Clicks in a policy-driven organization tend not to exist. I've worked in some environments where, like, if you weren't a part of the right clique, you were not going anywhere in that agency. My first agency, I mean, I had no opportunity to rise in the ranks because I was just not a part of that group. So was that agency I was working for policy-driven or personality-driven? Personality-driven. They were doing good service. The agency was growing. So from the outside, everything looked like it was fine, but from the inside, it was a little chaotic. It was a challenging environment to work in. And so if any of you are policy-driven individuals, you want to know why you're doing what you're doing, what does the ADA say, and what does da-da-da in our policies, and you're working in a personality-driven organization, is probably one of your worst professional experiences, right? And we have to always ask ourselves, no matter where we are, is this the right place for me, right? Is this where I have opportunities to grow? Is this where I have opportunities to impact service quality and to make it better and for us to meet the needs of our riders with disabilities? In many personality-driven organizations, the answer is going to be no. You're never going to be asked what your opinion is, what you should do. You're always going to be told what you should do. And even when you question, wait, that's not right because the ADA says this. I have so many people calling me to say, well, my manager wants to do it this way, but in the training you said that this and this and this, and I said, I understand. And then we start talking about the whole policy versus personality-driven organization thing. Public transit's a tricky environment, right? So, and it can impact, our environment absolutely can impact the quality of the services that we provide, the level of compliance that we have. It does. All right. So who's successful in this type of organization, as I shared? Policy-driven organizations, people that want a reason why we're doing what we're doing. They want to know that we can be doing it consistently, that it's safe for us to do it, that there's rationale behind the decisions that we make, the policies that we have, right? I think, what do you think some of the pros of a policy-driven organization would be? Probably the consistency, right? Any cons? What about a con of working for a policy-driven organization?
Well, one thing I can think of is sometimes people kind of commingle them. So they'll try to defend their personal practice or choice with a policy, but it's kind of subject to their interpretation of it.
Yes.
And maybe they don't really implement the full policy. They just pick and choose the pieces they like.
Yeah.
They say, this is why it is this way. And then you actually look at the policy and you say, well, that's not really what that says.
You're right. It is very possible that even though we have a policy-driven organization, does that guarantee we have great policies? It doesn't. So nothing's perfect, but I think we could probably work within the confines of a policy-driven organization, perhaps a little easier than we can a personality-driven. Yes?
So one of
reasonable modification.
Ah.
It's not consistent with their policy.
Ah, yes. That's possible. So when we receive a request, well, most of the time, requests for modifications, they don't come to us as that, right? They come to us as a complaint. They come to us as a driver talking about what this rider wanted, and they said, no, I can't do that. I mean, what about a bus driver or bus operator that is requested to walk a customer across the street because that rider is visually impaired, they missed their stop, and they want assistance to get to the bus stop across the street to go back to their stop, right? But I'm sure we all have policies, I hope formally written policies, telling bus operators to never leave their vehicle unattended, right? But this is a person with a disability, with a visual impairment. What do we do about that? I would consider that to be a request for a modification of policy, but I can't tell you what to do. Right? There's a lot of factors involved. If I'm talking through that issue, I'm thinking to myself, well, what's going on with that intersection? Is there a crosswalk and lighting there? Is it a 4-lane intersection? Is it an 8-lane intersection? They're driving 60 miles an hour. I mean, there's a lot of information that I need to consider before I perhaps consider modifying my policy, right? And that's why also the ADA allows riders to travel with personal care attendants if they need assistance in these ways. So there's a lot for us to think about and consider, but there is no such thing as perfect. And even with our policies and reasonable modification, it does require us to be flexible. We can't necessarily just automatically say no to something without considering, especially the part of it is, they are requesting a modification of policy in order to use your service. Well, if we don't modify our policy, they cannot use the service. So that could be discrimination if we make the wrong choice, right? Yes.
So is that like when we contact the community leaders or the city or whatever to say, hey, put a crosswalk there, put the light thing where
right.
for the people that can't see.
Right. That could be part of our communication circle, trying to make sure that our community is safer and more usable for people with disabilities. I probably wouldn't do that if it happened once or twice, but if we're finding there's an intersection that people with visual impairments are using regularly and really struggling with, I think that would make a lot of sense, absolutely. So.
I mean, because it's not even just for people with disabilities, but also just for
You're right.
Like how you always see kids getting hit.
Yes. You're right.
Case scenario, stuff like that.
Yes. No, the more information we can share, the better. Yes.
I don't know that you can define this, but is there a line between modification and exception? Because I know the organization I work for, we have very strong policies. We get challenged regularly and we win regularly.
Okay.
In other words, so we know that our policies are pretty solid. The situation we get into is if we allow an exception for all, that's one, then we have to allow an exception for all. So they get very cautious about making an exception because we don't want to be able, we don't want to be challenged and say, oh, well, you did it for this one, and we have to do it for all. So where is that line between modification and exception?
Yes. I wouldn't say that your policies are strong. I would say that your desire to follow your policies, that is where your strength lies. Because an agency that has a lot of good detailed policy, an agency that doesn't, what makes us determine whether we're going to provide a modification or not is the choice of whether you're going to do it or not, right? Not our policies per se. So, and we need to have that. We need to have conviction in our policies that we are going to follow them so that we are challenged with this issue of the wagon. Our policies are very clear here. We cannot have any item that is taking up a wheelchair securement area or blocking a doorway or blocking an aisle or blah, 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 blah. If our policies are rock solid on that, then the decision about the wagon is a no-brainer. It doesn't fit the definition of a wheelchair. It can only be transported in a wheelchair securement area. We're not interested in doing any of that. So can you see how, yes, the policy that you have is very helpful, but it's really the strength of your desire to follow your policies. That is the strength within an organization, often a policy-driven organization. And so I would applaud agencies that do that, because I'm helping agencies right now these potential accommodations. And why are they struggling? Why do they need my help? Because they lack the confidence in their own policies and decision making to make a decision. And so what I hear from you is that your organization is not lacking the confidence to make a decision. So do you see why I say it's not the policies, although those are very helpful, it's your conviction about following your policies? So the agencies that struggle to make these decisions are just those agencies that don't feel like they have the expertise or the policies to help them. Or someone throws out attorney, all of a sudden they start losing their you-know-what. I mean, I'm in a call yesterday with a client, and the writer said, I've already secured the services of an attorney, and they were losing it. And I said, but just because they made that statement, it doesn't change anything we're doing right now, right? We're still, obviously what it tells us is, okay, wonderful. I hear what you're saying, and so internally we're like, now we really need to well document this and prepare all of our information and decision making and communication in case we find ourselves in court having to defend ourselves. That's very helpful information, because a lot of times agencies will not formalize the information, the documentation, the incident reports. They won't formalize it because they just think it's a complaint and it's going to go away and no big deal. And then all of a sudden in 6 months they get the complaint filed in court, and then they're like, oh my God! And then now they're scrambling, right? So there was a hand over here. Is there a hand over here? No? Okay. So I think we can see the benefits, and obviously my maybe preference for a policy-driven organization, but I think personality within an organization absolutely has a vital role to play if it's within an organization that is in need of an evolution, right? There's been a transit director in this role for 30 years, and in 30 years, nothing has changed. But a lot has changed in the world. A lot has changed in our communities, but perhaps not within the service. And so someone that is personality driven can be the catalyst that we need to drive that change, to reopen our policies, to create an accessibility community of riders with disabilities and disability organizations, and to make things more transparent. So that personality can create a lot of change and improvement. And hopefully they have enough internal awareness and understanding of how we comply and how we provide safe services, so that when the time comes, they flip the switch to change their agency out of personality-driven and now flip it into the policy-driven processes and all the work we've been doing the last several years, right? I've seen that happen. I've been that person with certain organizations and as a consultant for agencies. And so, I come in to help your organization. It's my personality and my knowledge, and we're making all these changes. We're doing all these things. And then it gets turned over, and now you're operating as a policy-driven organization, right? That's ideally how it would work. So, time flies, doesn't it? Okay. I'd love to, I can go through the pillars of accessibility. Let me highlight those where agencies struggle the most with, okay? So let's talk about pillar number 2, policies. What do good policies look like with regards to denying service? So my guidance to you is that we have specific examples in our policies as well as in our rider information, our website information, our rider's guides, right? That's pillar number 5, rider education. We need specific examples of what unsafe conduct is. What does direct threat mean? What is an out-of-control service animal? Right? It's not enough to say services will be denied to a service animal that is out of the owner's control. What does that mean? The animal is growling, lunging, barking incessantly, nipping, right? These are all specific examples of of an unsafe or out of control service animal. So when we don't have policies that provide specific examples, I get calls all the time about this. What does your policy say? Because they want to deny services to someone boarding with a service animal, but they're struggling with defining whether the animal is out of control or not. Well, how does your policy define an out of control service animal? And obviously their policy doesn't, right? And so having these details, I've said already a few times, right? Items in our vehicles that don't block the aisle, block the door, take a seat, all of these things, those would also be specific examples of when services would be denied to someone or someone boarding with something that creates these unsafe situations, right? So if we don't have specific examples of what an unsafe conduct is on our vehicle, who's going to decide whether something is safe or not? The driver, the operator. And maybe 9 times out of 10, they're going to make the right choice, but all it takes is that one. All it takes is one, especially right now, we're desperate for drivers. We're probably holding on to drivers that under normal conditions we would not. They're just not performing at the level we need. They're not sensitive enough, right, to meet the needs of riders with disabilities and for us to be comfortable that we are complying with the ADA, but we're desperate, so we're leaving them. That is potential right there for some mistakes. And so another reason why we want well-written policies is because when we don't have them, we are leaving it up to our staff, whoever they are, to make the decision themselves. And again, maybe 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 times out of 100, they're making the right choice. But I'll tell you, even that 1% makes me nervous, right? So everything has its own role, right? Body odors, this is a huge issue, always coming my way. What is the standard for body odor, and can we deny services to someone? Well, the ADA in a nutshell tells us that we cannot deny services to someone simply because, whatever the situation, they are creating an annoyance. Okay? Body odors most of the time are annoying. Is it possible that someone's body odor makes it impossible for the driver to operate the vehicle safely? Yes, it is, but that is a very high standard. So keep that in mind, right? Someone can smell like urine, but from the ADA's perspective, that's not the same as they're standing in a puddle of urine wanting to board your vehicle. I hope I'm not getting too gross, but listen, I mean, Utah is the Wild West. Public transit, our vehicles are the Wild West, like especially fixed route bus. Anything goes in there, right? So odors in themselves, in my experience, are often an annoyance. They're disruptive. I don't like it, but it's not creating an unsafe situation for the other riders or for the driver. So I know that's a very high standard, and that's not typically what people want to hear, but it is reflective of the ADA circular from 2015. If you haven't all seen this, I recommend that you read the portions related to ADA and operating requirements and denial of service, because it has the ADA regulation and then it's followed often by several paragraphs of discussion from the FTA and examples. And you could start to create in your mind, start to understand what they think is reasonable, and that will help you in making decisions in your service. The ADA circular from 2015. That's what it's called, or 2015 ADA circular. You do a search, it should be the top search that pops up. Well, let's talk about very quickly training staff to proficiency. We need them to be experts. Okay, so I would have to say it can be interpreted that if your training doesn't include any hands-on wheelchair securement practice, how can we make them experts at wheelchair securement? If your wheelchair securement training only has them securing manual wheelchairs, and at least 50% of the time people are boarding in scooters and or power wheelchairs, I don't know if we're creating experts in wheelchair securement. So we really need to think about what is our staff experiencing out there? What is our ridership demographic? What devices are they using, etc.? How many service animals are in our community? If it's a lot, you need to spend more time to make sure they know how to properly communicate and support the needs of someone using a service animal. If hardly anyone ever boards with service animals, maybe it's not a big issue. I mean, we still need to address it, but we focus on things that are a higher priority, right? So I think that's maybe my most important guidance on training, and obviously it has to be ongoing, right? How do we ensure that our staff consistently deliver safe, compliant services? Well, that's pillar number 4, right? Oversight. But we also do that by way of refresher training. I hope your drivers are receiving refresher training at least annually, right? At least every year. And where do we get the content from our refresher training? I think our complaints is a great place to start, right? What are people complaining about? Whether they are valid complaints or not, after you have investigated them, they are still an opinion about your service, whether valid or invalid. And so I think that's a great place to start when we're talking about creating our refresher training. Oversight. So for the last 10 years or so, the most significant findings that FTA's consultants have had with regards to the triennial review process have been a lack of a formal oversight process, especially specific to those of you that use contractors. We can't just sign a contract and turn it over to your contractor and expect that they're going to be doing what they need to be doing. I mean, most of the time they are. I'm not going to say they're not. But we have to be able to show that we are watching and we have documentation and reporting, right? So we have to show that we're a part of the process. And I think it's especially important with contractors because most of the RFPs that I have seen for contracting services out say little more than the contractor will comply with the ADA. I don't even know what that means. I don't even know what that means. I know of agreements where the contractor, I was just having this conversation last week with the client, and the contractor was on the call. And the client had a set of policies for operating service. This was a county. And then they referred to another set of operating policies. And guess whose policies those were? The contractors. And I said, so you have 2 sets of policies on the books. Which ones are being followed? And the county staff just went like, and the contractor said, well, we're following our policies. And I said to county staff, well, are these policies consistent? Are they? So I could see like, oh, I'm about to open up a giant can of worms. And that's not really what we were here to do right now. So I kind of talked out of that conversation. But I left the county staff with this idea that, oh my God, I don't really think we know what's going on. And that's a horrible place to be when something goes wrong. It seems like, oh, this is great. We just write a check every month and they're providing our accessible services. Oh, and this is great. It can make someone who is not a true transit professional or who has very little transit experience, it can make them look like the most effective transit manager. Until something goes wrong, and that's when we start to find out what's a person's knowledge and expertise. What is the county's level of control and involvement in what is happening out there? And all of a sudden we start to realize, like my client did, the county, like, oh my God, what is this feeling? You know, because they thought everything was fine until that point. So we have to be very careful with that. So oversight of our services, including whether if we have the contractor relationship or not, oversight of those services. What is telling me, what policy do I have telling me when the supervisor needs to go out and make observations? How many times a year is it? What does the form look like? What's the content of it? Right? Is there wheelchair securement observations on there? Et cetera, et cetera. I would say yes to all of those things. Right? So when the FTA comes and says, we'd like some information, reporting of your oversight efforts for May of 2022. You got your folder, boom, you have your sheets, you have your evaluations. Maybe you have a mystery writer program. You pull the report from that month. You see, now you can answer that question. But if you don't have a program, program doesn't have to be perfect, perfectly defined, A to Z, but it has to be something. It has to be something real that you can pull out and show them, these are my efforts with regards to oversight. Attending safety meetings, especially if it's a contractor, things like that. So I would say the most significant challenge that agencies face with rider education is simply realizing that they have a rider, that this is a process to educate. A lot of websites out there are lacking significant detail, right? We want enough detail on there so that riders know, number one, how to use our service and what they can expect when using our service. I would say that that would include a description of the ways that drivers, operators can and cannot assist. Drivers can assist riders with disabilities to board vehicles using the lift, using the ramp, etc. If you allow package assistance, your policy would detail your package assistance. Drivers, operators will not assist in the following ways: lifting, carrying, dragging, taking possession of a service animal, right, etc., etc., etc. We need to tell people what they can and cannot do. And so I would say that that is very important. And I love having either topic brochures or seat drops. It can be the same thing. Because when something goes wrong on a vehicle, like there's an argument over the service animal policy, and there's a rider complaining and disagreeing. Wouldn't it be lovely if a driver could just pull out a nice brochure on your service animal policy and language in there from the ADA, and to say, I know we're having this misunderstanding. Here's some information about our service animal policy. If you have any additional questions, you can contact customer service on the back. Or about securing a wheelchair if it's mandatory in your agency. Or about the issues of odor, or just in general denying services. Or about devices that can or cannot board and are allowed or not on your vehicles. Right? We could have a number of topic brochures that help us, that will be most helpful when there is an issue, a complaint, something coming our way. So I'm always being asked, for our last few minutes, I'm always being asked, how can I learn more, right? How can I do a better job in my work? How can our policies be a little better? I have a program called ADA Compliance 360. I just graduated my first class of transit managers, and we go through these 5 pillars, and you do homework. And we talk about your responses, and I help walk you through what ultimately can become, if you want it to, the creation of an ADA compliance plan and strategy for your agency. I would say the smaller your agency, probably the more important this is, because smaller agencies tend to either have a little less detail in policies and or a little less structure, or 1 or 2 people, they're doing everything. And so it's hard to understand. So I would really recommend that program.
This one?
No, that is, also you have a sheet there. It's called the ADA Compliance Support Membership Program. And so I've shared with you, I have clients that call me and I help them work through issues, and they take my trainings. For less than $125 a month, your agency could sign up for me to be your ADA compliance expert. You need to talk through making a reasonable modification or not. Is this particular incident or issue, does it meet the standard of denying services? The list goes on and on and on. So I can definitely help and support you with that if you're interested. And just in general, I have lots of trainings going on all the time. I have webinars coming up, ADA compliance, eligibility determination in paratransit, bus stop accessibility. So there are just so many ways that I can help support your agency if you need it. So please do consider me a resource. Even if you don't sign up for these programs, you're always welcome to call me. I'm always happy to share my knowledge and to help you down the path towards making the right decisions, or perhaps making some changes within your organization if that's what is needed. So please do consider me a resource in your ADA compliance work, okay?
How do we find out about the 360?
You can go online to my website. It's adaguru.co. And you can also go to that website, adaguru.co, and at the bottom of the page, you can sign up for my emails and ADA tips and all of my other training opportunities. I am in the process of planning an ADA compliance conference that will be coming up as well, and some other in-person trainings that are really targeted towards management staff to help them kind of get a handle of their services and of their programs. So my time is up. Thank you all so much. Yes?
I just wanted to touch on your
Oh,
And also, if you want to in your area, our trainers can come train your trainer.
that's great.
And also, if you are a 5310 urbanized representative, you can include travel training services in your operations budget.
Excellent. So UTA offers travel training in your community, and if you're 5310, you can request funding as a part of that process for travel training as well. So yes, travel training, for some agencies, they feel like it is cost prohibitive. They don't feel like they're getting the value for the hundreds or even thousands of dollars that they're spending. But remember, paratransit trips are our most expensive form of transportation, those trips. And so just diverting, 20, 30 a month, which is not a lot for someone that uses your service regularly, you'll get that money back in under a year. And if this is a rider who's going to be with you for 10, 20, 30 years, look at the savings that travel training provides. So thank you all so much for your time and attention. I'll be off to the side if I can answer any more of your questions, but thank you all so much.
Please take